Hi everyone. Yeah, welcome and thank you for coming to this session because I know you had a choice. But so I think what I'm really going to talk about is quite I suppose, is a relatively broad sort of thinking about how we can think about institutions in slightly different ways, and some of the ways we might reimagine, or we might find ways to think differently and to imagine differently. So I work at, as Himanshu said, I work at TU Eindhoven. I also run something called the Imaginaries Lab, which is kind of a sort of cross between a studio and a research sort of group, where we do, mostly what we do is sort of publish or create and publish sort of methods for helping people imagine in different ways. And it's, it's a kind of side thing, but hopefully it will get better as we go along. But so this quote, which is from J.G. Ballard. This is actually from 2006, so this is quite a long time ago. But I think in recent years, we've started to see this idea that reality is kind of, to some extent, a sort of mass of competing fictions being much more central in the way we think about news, the way we think about media, but also how we think about a lot of these kind of big issues in society and facing humanity, from climate change to pandemics to inequality and so on. This idea that there's these kind of competing stories about what reality is, or what truth is, or what's right or what's wrong, and obviously, perhaps accentuated by the rise of some aspects of AI, perhaps. So I think it's an interesting question to explore, because anyone working in this space is kind of, to some extent, creating these fictions alongside dealing with them. And when we saw during the pandemic, we saw a lot of this, where there were these kind of competing narratives, right? And I think part of it is explained to some extent by this idea. This is from 1928, from Thomas and Thomas. This idea that they were psychologists. This idea that, to some extent, if people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences, whether or not the actual belief was kind of correct, whatever that means. If you believe that COVID was caused by Bill Gates or George Soros or 5G and so on, then whether or not that was true, if you act in that way, or if whole societies act in that way, or if significant numbers of people act in that way, or act as if climate change isn't happening, or act as if I don't know, somehow magic AI, Elon Musk will fix everything for us, then that to some extent, there are consequences of that, even if that idea was not necessarily correct. And I guess that's obvious, but it's a sort of fundamental thing that we perhaps don't always think about when we're thinking about these things. So I look at this idea of imaginaries, which is a concept from sociology originally, which is sort of this question of, like, how do people imagine and make sense of things that are often they're very big or complex or invisible. So that might be things like, for example, the future, or different futures that don't even exist yet. How do people imagine those things? And what happens as a result? But it's also things like climate crisis, or aspects of, how does government work, or how do politics work, or even how do technologies work? And how do people make sense of these ideas? So something like mental models that you might think of often in design, but at a societal scale. And where do those stories come from? Where do those ideas come from? And what are the results? And as kind of creative people, or researchers, or designers, what can we do to interact with that? So some people have said that we're in a crisis of imagination at present, right? So this is from Amitav Ghosh. The idea that we, as a species, as a humanity, can't think of new ways to do things differently. We're trapped in our own ways of thinking. And I'm not sure I quite agree with that, but I can see where he's coming from. But I think I prefer this idea from Arundhati Roy, again, as actually Michael Slaby mentioned earlier. This idea that another world is not only possible, actually, she, in this case, is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. And I think this suggests more of an idea that actually we can create different ways of doing things. We can imagine differently, if only we pay attention to voices and ideas that are not necessarily always heard. And it suggests, to some extent, those ideas are already here, but also that we could create new ones. We can create different worlds. So, obligatory, this kind of slide. If you look at what sort of imaginaries, if you like, of AI are, for some reason, as lots of people have pointed out, for some reason AI is blue. I don't know why, but in kind of popular consciousness, and it's mainly made up of kind of Android crash test dummy looking things and printed circuit board brains for some reason. Now we can laugh at this and say this is, this is really a public imaginary of AI, but this does affect things. This affects what gets funded. This sort of imagery affects how it's presented. It affects what priorities companies have, governments have, and so on. It does matter, right? These kind of imaginaries. If we look at climate change, for a long time, polar bears were the, images of polar bears on shrinking ice flows were one of the main sort of images that we use to represent climate change. Increasingly now, it's going in an orange direction, whereas it wasn't previously, and that's due to wildfires, right, or due to maps of heated, of kind of temperature maps, which is interesting, right? And of course, a lot of AI image generators that are trained on these labeled images are, they have their own interpretations. This is what Midjourney gave me a couple of days ago. It's still polar bears in relation to climate change, but now there's a lot of smoke and fire and stuff in the background, although it's interesting that it's mostly coming from like oil refineries on fire or cities on fire rather than trees, which is, anyway, I don't know what the significance of that is. But one of the points is that these image generators, although they're presented as opening up our imagination, enabling us to think of new things, which possibly is true, they also rely very heavily on what was labeled, what was in the data sets, what was labeled in a particular way. So in a way, they kind of anchor us in these past imaginaries and kind of reproduce them in new ways. Now, there are people who've tried to sort of interrogate this, do some different things with it. There are some really great projects like Climate Visuals that tries to get essentially better images of climate change. What is it actually like for people in everyday life, to try to get journalists, media, news, and so on to use different sorts of images to represent it. And there's a similar one, Better Images of AI, looking at better images of AI essentially, which a lot of it is about showing the humans in the loop, as they put it. So people who are labeling data sets, or people in kind of at the behind the scenes of these things, like the human labor involved in these things. And just, before I get off this point, this is what government looks like, because we're talking about institutions today. This is what government looks like to Google Images. It's mostly American. There's a lot of things, the pictures of like the US Capitol building, but labeled the White House, which is interesting, and various things. But it's very, there's not many people, and where they are, they're not everyday people. They're politicians themselves, or they're presidents, or they're people like that. And I think that affects this way of thinking about or imagining these institutions affect what we think they can do, and how we think we can interact with them, and what we think they represent in society. This is what Midjourney thinks government looks like, which is interesting. I don't know. I think there's something there I don't know what the lesson is there, but it's interesting. Anyway, so aside from those, so I'm coming at this as a designer, and I know some of you are, many of you are, or people in kind of creative fields and media and so on. And I think in many ways, design is often about turning what people imagine into some form of reality, right? Now, what that means, lots of different things. It could be prototypes, it could be concepts, it could be actually usable things. But I think one of the stages that we can do when we sort of look at that from this point of view of these bigger societal imaginaries is often about getting imaginaries out of people's heads somehow and into this shared space together. How different people imagine the same thing, perhaps. We learn a lot from effectively just getting people to talk about it, to show it, to represent it, and then share with each other. How do you imagine climate change or climate crisis compared to someone else? How do you visualize it? What is in your mind? How do you think it affects you? And then we can do things differently as a result. And I've done a few projects over the years, sort of looking at this in different ways. This was a project at the Royal College of Art as part of a big European kind of energy project, where we essentially looked at what do people think energy looks like. You're told to save energy, but what do you imagine energy to be like? And it wasn't, it was essentially getting people to draw, getting members of the public, children, adults to draw what they imagined when they heard terms like energy. And from it, we kind of learned a lot about the metaphors that people use to explain these things and how it fits with their everyday life. In a similar way, perhaps this was a more recent project with my colleague Dara Byrne from Carnegie Mellon and a group of students, looking at how people often use sort of spooky or almost supernatural ideas to explain technologies they don't understand, which could be things like AI, but it could also be stuff like sort of home automation or recommender algorithms and things like that. What do people think is going on? And often they call up these ideas of sort of disembodied spirits or intelligences, as even if it's just like, I think my toaster wants me to do this, or sort of thing. And I'm not saying this is necessarily very useful, but I think it's interesting to kind of interrogate these sort of ideas that people have. Most recently, some of my students at Eindhoven had this is a course called Researching the Future Every Day, where we're sort of trying to make these imaginaries of futures tangible. Students got a letter from 2038 from a fictional kind of ministry, telling them that they were going to be sent back to 2023. 15 years in time to effectively to influence, to make a difference, to intervene in 2023 by showing people visions of different futures that could exist in 2038 if we don't do things differently. And so a lot of it was related to climate, but some of it was also related to kind of corporate takeovers of certain fields or these kinds of things that students created. And this is part of a bigger project with partners in Norway and Netherlands and the UK about kind of public imaginaries of sustainable futures. What do people think sustainability means, and how do they actually envisage it, and in terms of what it can do? Some of this work has also been about, well, a lot of it has been about metaphors, in fact, right? And I'll come on to that more in a minute. But we often use metaphors to explain things that we can't see, right? We transform something that's invisible or complicated into something that we can see or we can understand. And this project, originally, this was developed by Delaney Ricketts and myself around the mental landscapes sort of kit, which is effectively model landscape elements, hills, trees, rivers, valleys, roads, and so on, that people can use together to build metaphorical landscapes of how they imagine something like particularly the future, right? So this was a group last month in Rotterdam who were building collectively a model of a kind of landscape of the future of a world in transition, where different transitions, environmental and social were happening, with metaphors like hills that we have to climb over, or things that stop us seeing things, or different paths that might be available to humanity and how we make those choices. I'm not saying it's necessarily it offers certain things, it has limitations, but also these kinds of activities can be used to reimagine institutions. And this is a project with the Centre for Unusual Collaborations in Utrecht around, in this case, getting, so a bit like the futures wheels that you see out there, but in a sort of form of these kind of networks of reimagining what academia could be like and collaborations could be like by people constructing these kind of models of the consequences or possible consequences and consequences of different changes. And so, yeah, metaphors are central to a lot of this, right? And I think they're central to the way we can reimagine institutions, or ways that we might approach this. Because often the metaphors we use at present are quite harmful, right? So if you think of something like, I mean, a lot of the ways people talk about data being the new oil, or even economies, as I think Timothy will talk about later, around like the idea of growth being sort of, in something that has to be, is unquestioned, right? The idea that economies are things that grow, or that have to grow, is, it's a metaphor that in some ways is harmful, right? But it can also be that metaphors can limit the way we think about things. If we think of institutions in particular ways, we can't think differently about what they could be. And so I think, new metaphors, different ones, can enable us to generate ideas. They can enable us to reimagine in quite a low effort way, honestly, right? Like, it's a relatively easy way into thinking differently. And so, as so often with designers, we made a toolkit, a kind of card deck. This was new metaphors, which was developed with a lot of students and also designers from different backgrounds over the last few years. And all it really does is it prompts you with things from nature, from the world around us, that potentially could work as metaphors for other things. So in this case, how could a ladder be a metaphor for democracy? It's not a right answer, but it might prompt us to think differently about what democracy might mean. And so if you want to try it out, if you go to newmetaphors.com, it provokes you with some random combinations or juxtapositions, and you can see what you might get from it. But I think with institutions, so what I did for this talk was I picked a few cards at random and thought, well, what could they inspire? Could they inspire a different type of institution or a different way of thinking about them? And this one, which is traces of previous messages. So it's a close-up photo of a lamppost or a sort of telephone pole where lots of posters have been stapled to it over the years and torn off and gone, the staples have gone rusted and so on. This made me think, what about an institution that's a kind of community memory in the same way as this pole is? to support people through changes to everyday life, perhaps, right? We have certain institutions like museums that I know, and galleries, I know that Sarah was going to talk about, that have this kind of collective memory role, but they could be used in very different ways, right? They present a certain view of the memory of a society, not necessarily the views of everyone, right? And I wonder whether there are new types of institutions, particularly in times of massive change, where we do want to remember certain things, even if it's remembering ways of life that have had to go away, right? A way of perhaps managing grief to some extent, having to deal with huge changes to everyday life. Maybe we need some ways of like actually processing that rather than just pretending that it's all bad and it's all gone. I think this is something about how institutions could function. Another card that I picked out was this one, what does a seagull see? I think that's a photo of Oslo there. And the prompt here is kind of like, who's doing the imagining in institutions? And this sort of prompted me to think, well, maybe we could have institutions that are set up to enable viewpoints or voices or the kind of rights of non-humans to be represented much more clearly, much more strategically. How you do that, of course, is very difficult. And I know, there are lots of movements around different parts of the world around giving voices to nature and giving rights to, to trees or to rivers in different places. But why do they represent national boundaries? At present, those are mostly done within countries. But of course, countries are, a human construct, right? And so perhaps we need different types of institutions if we did go down this route that don't use that. Tree bark was an interesting one, or perhaps tree rings. Made me think about maybe in the same way as, the bark is dead, but it kind of protects the new growth. Maybe we need some form of institutions that enable kind of caring for new institutions to emerge from these kind of dead infrastructures, which might just be reusing old buildings in the same way as this is done. But I think there's more to it than that, right? What does it mean to have institutions that have this kind of role of caring for new things to emerge from the dead or the dying, which might be very important in the years ahead. So in my own context, I'm in an academic kind of context, and I think I'm quite interested in how we might reimagine what academia is like, or reimagine what education and research are like, and how they actually have a much more practical kind of application. And I think really, there's obvious things. Universities need to take the world seriously that we're in, right? And I think universities could actually prefigure operating in new ways. Universities are mostly, apart from Trump University, mostly non-profit institutions that have thousands of motivated people. They have facilities, they have political capital, they have buildings, they have people who are really, interested in stuff. They could be living as if it was 2030. Universities could be operating as if they were already in a future to experiment with new ways of doing things, new models, without the pressure of shareholders, without the pressure of delivering certain things. And I think we could do a lot with that. And I'd love to see, and hopefully be involved in kind of developing some new models for combined education, research, kind of practice studios that can act in the world and actually produce and share knowledge right now. And there are some good models out there. And I think there's something here about this hybrid of practice and and new knowledge generation that could be part of this idea of imagination infrastructure that I know that Cassie Robinson will talk about later today. But I think there's possibilities there for different ways of doing things. So just finally then, to sum up, I think get Imaginaries out of people's heads into some shared space together to do things differently as a result, right? I think that's a fundamental thing that we don't always do. We don't always question, are we thinking about the same thing when we think about this concept? Are we as creative people, you've got so many methods for actually bringing those out, getting people to build things, to draw together, to make things together, to talk about it. We should always be looking at whose imaginaries are present and whose are not. Who is not represented, or what is not represented, and that might be people, but it might also be as we saw, non-humans, or it might be the rights of other entities. And I think then we can reimagine possible futures together, and it might be with some sort of, it might be inspired by some method of almost like random prompts like that. But I think we can probably do better than the metaphors. But it was just a quick way of getting some ideas. But I think, and then finally, make them tangible, make them experiential, so that people can actually effectively inhabit them, right? We can try out or rehearse some of these different ways of living. And that's often done in design. It's often done through kind of speculative design or design fiction, but it doesn't have to be. There's so many ways of storytelling, and throughout human history, there are so many ways of making fictional or alternative ways of being or living tangible and relatable to people. So I would, and I will finish there. Thank you all.